My presentation today focuses on an issue which has been emphasised by IFPRI for many, many years, the problem of rising food prices. A key question over the next 40 years is it real? We've seen long, long periods of food prices declining. Prices went up, gave us an enormous wake-up call in 2007, 2008. They've come back, but by no means back to their original point. It seems likely that prices will stay relatively high, and that's one of the questions we want to look at in the paper. If it is real that food prices will remain high, is this going to be a serious problem from a poverty point of view? If it is a problem, or rather assuming it's a problem, what to do about it? One of the key responses is to raise farm productivity. And if we're trying to raise farm productivity, should we take the sort of approach that Klaus Schmidt-Hebel mentioned this morning? Just look for productivity wherever you can get it and make sure you have an efficient system for delivering productivity? Or should you try to look at those areas perhaps where there's the biggest bang for the buck in terms of lowering poverty? And then, of course, another policy response, which seems natural to many policymakers, seems natural on first blush, is to think about raising farm output by raising farm prices, perhaps by targeting some sort of reduction in imports, some improvement in self-sufficiency ratios. We've got to expect that policymakers will be attracted to that sort of policy. So what are the implications of that for poverty? We know, after all, that most poor people are in rural areas, so it might seem on first inspection that raising food prices would help farmers, would help the poor, and might lower poverty. So that's an important question that needs to be addressed. What Maris and I have done in this work is to set out some very simple global projections, to look rather at some very simple global macro projections we've taken more or less off the shelf, with this key stylized fact that the global population's projected to rise by around 34% over the next 40 years. So we're going up from over 6 to around 9 billion people, a very, very big increase in population in a situation where we don't have the available additional arable land that can be pulled in. That's been a part of the solution to the big increases in population we've had in the past. And there's a lot of regional variation too. In sub-Saharan Africa, the projections we're using, and I think most of the projections would expect still quite large increases in population, about 120%. In East Asia, very small increases in population, about 10% over the period, moderate growth in Latin America, and then in Europe and Central Asia, actually a decline in population. The macro projections that we're using, and I think most of the consensus macro projections over the long period, look at very strong growth overall in developing countries. With high productivity growth in East and South Asia, much higher projected income growth in Asia than in Latin America. I think that's something, if those projections are borne out, that's going to have very important implications, not only for income and for poverty, but also for patterns of trade, for reasons that I'll come to in a moment. One thing that seems to me very important, very high savings and investment rates in East Asia coupled with high income growth rates. What that implies is very, very large increases in the capital stock. And those of us who can remember how to spell Rybczynski from our trade theory classes will know that this implies pulling resources away from the most labour-intensive sectors, particularly agriculture, and has big implications for the structure, or can have big implications for the structure of the economy, particularly in regions like East and South Asia, where there's expected to be very high rates of growth and high rates of saving. So how does global growth affect food prices? Well, obviously population growth, and the most simple factor, increases food demand directly with an elasticity of 1. More mouths to feed with the same amount of land. Income growth increases demand as East and South Asia particularly grow richer. can afford more food and more of the livestock products that increase food demand. There are all sorts of subtleties. As Ashok often points out, it's the poor chicken that bears the greatest burden of the increased demand for meat in South Asia, or particularly in India. High rates of investment pull resources out of agriculture in developing countries. In all the modelling work that I've done, when you have these high rates of growth and high rates of investment, those Rybczynski effects that come, they jump right out of the theory textbook and they give you very large shifts of resources out of agriculture. I think they contribute to that very rapid pulling of labour out of agriculture that Ashok mentioned a moment ago. Improvements of agricultural productivity raise output, the same amount of land and other inputs give you more output, but as well as that, you've got a higher effective price. It's more profitable for the producer at any given actual price, and so that increases output as well. And productivity growth, of course, is more important than in the past because we can't pull in the land. How does global growth affect poverty? Well, one of the things that if we are having high and rising food prices, and that's a big if, and one of the things we look at, hurts consumers who have to pay more for food, obviously helps net selling farm households whose incomes rise. Higher economy-wide productivity lowers poverty worldwide, raises real incomes, but of course hurts the people who are buying now more expensive services. Higher agricultural productivity increases output, as I mentioned, and so you've got some direct impacts on producers as well as the price-induced impacts. The type of technical change turns out to matter hugely for producers, and we, in some of our results, we look at some of those differences. The analytical framework that we're using, we use a global CGE, computable general equilibrium model, to examine the impact of projections on agricultural outcomes. The economy is expanding, but it's not expanding in neutral ways. It's expanding in very differential ways, depending on the rate of population growth, the labour force growth, capital stock growth, and so on. In the baseline, we assume equal productivity growth across sectors, and we look at the implications of that. To examine the impact of price changes on poverty, or rather of all changes on poverty, we use a detailed household model. We allow households to adjust, consistent with the CGE model, and to benefit, of course, from improvements in technological change. That lets us get at the individual households' changes in welfare and hence to look at poverty changes. The global CGE, we're using the standard GTAP model. We use the latest GTAP database. We need more agricultural detail, so we split sectors up using the SplitCom software. We use relatively high trade elasticities. There's a lot of scope for adjustment over a 40-year period, and we need to make some fixes to deal with forestry and fishing, where otherwise the natural resource stock causes prices to go up. The household model, we're using 21 country models, drawing on detailed household surveys that give us information on the sources of income, the patterns of expenditure of households, the information that you need. We calculate welfare changes for each household. We've got the change in the cost of living, the change in business incomes, the change in wages on labour sold outside the household. So we capture the key elements that matter for poor people, especially poor people in rural areas. As I mentioned, we take into account the second-order impacts. So we allow for quantity adjustment by farm households who are selling food. They will sell more if the price goes up. We allow consumers to cut back. The household model coverage, we have the 21 countries. There are only 4 in Latin America, but enough to tell us some interesting stories. The biggest single sample, household sample, is Peru. Here. So I was very pleased to find that when preparing for this presentation. There are about a little over 150,000 households there that we're using to make inferences. We look at the base poverty rate, which is the latest available from the World Bank PovCal database, at $1.25 per day. The scenarios, 3 broad scenarios. Let's look at higher TFP, total factor productivity, and factor productivity is important worldwide, higher agricultural total factor productivity in developing countries, and the self-sufficiency policy, protect the primary agriculture to halve import shares in 2050. We also do some more focused analysis that gets at the question of if you're going to, and I hope, I trust and hope that the world will put a lot more resources into agricultural total factor productivity, where will the big payoffs be if there's an improvement in productivity? So we look at individual countries, we look at individual crops, we look at the type of technical change, factor and total productivity, and this really revealed to us just how many complex technical issues there are, and also the importance of the adoption rate. We're all concerned to make sure the TFP benefits smallholder producers, but the very, very smallest producers, perhaps they're very hard to get, hard to reach. So how far do we have to push this process? And at the very end, if you get down to the farmer who's farming a plot the size of this podium, it's not going to affect. Improving productivity is not going to be enough to change the lives of a person in that situation. And many people in that situation are fundamentally doing something else in any event. It might be a teacher with a small backyard plot. So the question of how far along the distribution of output to go becomes an important one. Well, when we do this baseline projection, the key thing here, primary agricultural output goes up, and the primary agricultural output price goes up by over 100% if you have uniform rates of productivity growth across the economy. Now, in the past, we've been able to achieve much higher rates of TFP growth in agriculture than in non-agriculture. There's quite a significant amount of literature. Devashish Mitra and I looked at it for a range of countries, especially for the industrial countries. It's very clear in the literature that TFP growth has been higher in agriculture than non-agriculture, but in developing countries as well, that appears to have been the case. So this is a pessimistic scenario. If we have similar rates of TFP in agriculture, and there is some evidence that TFP in agriculture has been slowing down, then we're likely to see increases in food prices over the next 40 years. If we have TFP growth rates that are about 1% higher, the sorts of result that you might get by investing more in agricultural TFP, then that can wipe out that increase in food prices. Essentially, agricultural prices with a higher TFP growth rate essentially go up by hardly anything, 4.8% over 40 years. What are the consequences of higher agricultural TFP worldwide on poverty? The first block here, and I wish I had one of those quite a bit by country, rather surprisingly, but in general there's a reduction, a substantial reduction in poverty if we have higher rates of TFP growth in agriculture. This comes back to the point Ashok made. Higher rates of output growth in agriculture clearly tend to be very helpful. If they're driven by productivity, that's very, very clear. If those output growth rates are driven by protection that raises prices and hurts consumers, then the general tendency is for poverty to rise and rise substantially, with one or two very, very tiny exceptions to that rule. What about if we have TFP growth that's higher only in developing countries? That's that's a large part now of the world agricultural production, but it's only part. It turns out the reductions in poverty are almost as large in that situation. Most of the benefits in terms of poverty reduction come from the improvements in productivity in developing countries, which really highlights the role of investment in agricultural total factor productivity or productivity growth. Here, for anyone who's had an eye test recently, here are the results by country, and we see quite a bit of dispersion. Peru, one of the relatively smaller effects, actually, surprisingly, in all of that, but there are many countries with quite substantial reductions, percentage point reductions in poverty rates, especially countries such as Bangladesh. Done very, very simply, these calculations, but a very consistent pattern there of TFP growth lowering poverty. Okay, so what about if we look globally, where do these channels come from? Where do these effects come from? Improvements in agricultural productivity, total factor productivity. The really large impacts come from the consumption effect globally. And this is coming from reductions in the price of food to consumers as a consequence of those improvements in total factor productivity. Very complex picture though. The producer impact is actually to raise poverty amongst producers. Now, why is that? We're getting an increase in output. We're assuming total factor productivity rises. A consequence of that with very inelastic demand curves is the point that Willard Cochrane raised many, many years ago in the US context, the treadmill effect. There is a reduction in the net income of producers simply because the price is falling. Now, this is very conditional on the type of productivity growth that we've assumed, but it's a very common type assumption about productivity growth and one that probably needs more detailed examination. The other major channel of impact is coming through benefits in terms of real wages. This is a very consistent sort of pattern. We get the same sort of pattern with developing countries' total factor productivity growth, very similar decline in poverty, and coming primarily from the two major sources. If we have protection, the producer effect is favourable as a consequence of higher prices. Farmers are better off, net selling farmers are better off, but consumers are worse off, and the overall effect is to raise poverty. If we look at Latin America, similar sort of picture for total factor productivity, smaller wage impacts given the countries that we're looking at, and protection quite a small story mainly because Latin America is primarily an exporter, whereas when we see the context of East and Southeast Asia, what we see here, bigger reductions in poverty. There's more poverty to begin with, and these consumer effects are very, very strong. But when we look at protection, it turns out to be very, very costly in East and Southeast Asia. It requires large increases in protection to reduce import levels in 2050 because there are large base imports. When we look at individual countries in Latin America, when you look at an improvement in productivity in an individual country, the consumers are better off because there's a local preference in demand. The producers are better off because world prices don't fall significantly when individual countries like Ecuador, Guatemala, Panama, Peru raise their agricultural productivity. So there's a different story there at the national policy making level. Similar sort of story again in East and Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, Korea, Cambodia, Nepal, Pakistan, East Timor, which has good survey data, only a small country, and Vietnam. But the big impacts, again, from consumer effects and from wages when you trace through where these reductions in poverty are coming from. Now, there's a question about where to put agricultural resources, TFP resources. If you can get a 1% improvement in productivity in a crop like rice, obviously you're going to get a bigger reduction. These are standard deviations from our sample, but the mean there, rice will give you obviously more of a reduction in poverty than a commodity like wool, which is over here. Some of these things are intuitively obvious, but the exact ranking contained a lot of surprises for us. Rice and wheat were clearly likely to be important, but vegetables turned out to be very, very important, simply because there is just so much output of vegetables and so much benefit as a consequence of that. Coming to the, I'm down almost to zero, the adoption rates question that I mentioned. If you get 100%, and here we're talking about total factor productivity, if you get 100% adoption, that's where you get the maximum gains for vegetables, maize, rice, just to illustrate these points. This is factor productivity. The dotted lines show you the benefit that comes from the improvements in income at constant prices to producers. So this graph's a little messy, but as you move up here, what we notice, this is 100% with all farmers in there, and these are the smallest farmers rising to the largest farmers. What you find is that the very, very smallest farmers, if you don't include the people who are producing just a tiny handkerchief-sized part, you don't get a terribly small loss in terms of the overall poverty impact. It's only after you leave out about 40%. Some of the very smallest farmers, it makes surprisingly little impact to the poverty on the poverty impacts. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's not important to reach smallholder farmers. I think it is terribly important, but I think we need to think about what it is we mean by smallholder farmers. When you look at a different type of productivity, something that reduces, saves inputs as well as factors used in production. So GM cotton, for instance, will be an example. Not only do you get more output for the factors that you put in, but you save on intermediate inputs like pesticides as well. Then you get larger poverty reduction impacts by commodity, and you get a different order. Rice, which is more input intensive than vegetables, for instance, rice comes out with the largest poverty reduction impact. And I'm now on to my final slide. Timekeeper, please take note and ease up on the whip. Just to conclude, projected growth may result in higher food prices. That's something we need to be very aware of. It really is going to be important to have higher productivity growth in agriculture going forward. The adverse impacts of higher food prices on poverty is best dealt with by raising productivity, especially in developing countries where there's almost as much benefit in terms of poverty reduction as there is from global agricultural productivity increase. Agricultural protection generally raises poverty, even though it's transferring to net sellers, some of whom are poor. In most cases, those benefits in terms of poverty reduction are outweighed by the increased costs on consumers, the poorest of whom spend 70–75% of their income on food. And this is even after allowing for adjustments in quantities supplied and demand. The poverty impact depends on which commodities benefit from higher productivity. Some of the commodities like rice, maize, and vegetables help not only through the improvement in productivity, but through the induced increases in output. The effects of output or factor augmenting technology are different, and we know from the literature on productivity that it matters what sort of productivity growth you get. And the adoption rate for new technologies also can affect the results. But we don't need to be absolutely fanatical about getting every producer. I think there needs to be some sort of pragmatic balance in terms of doing that, in terms of allocation of extension resources. Thank you very much.